Good morning. I'm Dusky Terry, President of ITC Midwest. For the third straight year, we are pleased to be the presenting sponsor for the Iowa Ideas Conference and extraordinarily proud of our partnership with the Gazette. As an electric transmission company serving 2/3 of the state, ITC Midwest is invested in and has a very real stake in the future of Iowa. We've supported this conference since its inception because we embrace its mission of gathering hundreds of Iowans together to explore the key questions and the big ideas that will shape the future of our state. ITC Midwest was formed in 2007 to improve electric transmission reliability and increase transmission system capacity in Iowa. And we followed through on that commitment with more than $4.1 billion in capital investments to date. Our investments in the system not only serve the changing needs of customers, they also provide additional capacities to support economic growth and development of low-cost renewable energy resources. Our investments have resulted in a 62% drop in transmission-related outages since ITC acquired the system and began operating it. From extreme weather events such as last year's derecho to the unprecedented transition to renewable energy, from the rapid adoption of electric vehicles to the increasing focus on energy system resilience, the electric utility industry is suddenly in the national spotlight. All of these forces reinforce the critical role of the transmission grid to support the changing landscape and ensure consumers have access to low-cost, clean, and reliable electricity. You know, we often talk about here at ITC about the power of connection, meaning connections are needed to deliver power to communities. There's also tremendous power when people connect to solve problems. Over the next couple of days, I hope you will engage in the breakout sessions, speak up during discussions, and share your ideas to create a brighter future. Open your mind to different points of view as we all work together to come up with the best solutions for making Iowa an even better place now and in the future. I want to thank you for your participation to help shape the future and wish you a great conference.
My name is Adam Sullivan. I'm an opinion columnist at the Gazette and also an Iowa Ideas moderator. And our session today is part of the policy track, and it's entitled Modernizing the Legislative Process. The main focus of our discussion is on how COVID-19 affected legislatures and how that might affect legislatures moving forward, even as the pandemic wanes or becomes endemic or ends. And so I've got a great group of panelists here today, and I'm going to let them in just a minute introduce themselves each. But I want to once again, if you're just getting on, remind you that you can ask questions from the audience. There's a way to do that through your webinar software. Type those in and those will get filtered to me, and we'll ask as many as we can. And I also want to remind our panelists that most of these questions are directed at one person or another, but I encourage you to jump in if you have something to add. We can absolutely keep this conversational as we do it. So with that, let me give each of our panelists 1 or 2 minutes to introduce themselves and explain a little bit about their work. And let me start with Charlie Smithson.
Thank you, Adam, for having me. I'm Charlie Smithson, the Secretary of the Iowa Senate, which means I'm the parliamentarian for the Senate, as well as the Chief Administrative Officer, which has a variety of duties. For your purposes today, a lot of my job is to help implement the directives of leadership in dealing with the technological challenges and enhancements we actually did this past legislative session to deal with COVID-19. I've been in government so long that I go back to another state in the early 1990s where they didn't even want to buy a fax machine because they didn't think anybody would use it to submit campaign finance reports. So I've gone from that clear to doing stuff by Zoom meetings during my government career. And I know we'll explore some of that during the hour as we go.
Thank you, Charlie, for being here with us. Rod?
Rod Boshart. I manage the Gazette's Des Moines Bureau. It's a one-horse operation, and I'm the horse. I joined the Gazette in 1989 after working for a short time for a couple of years at the Daily Iowan and then 8 years at United Press International. I spent 4 years before that in a family farm partnership. Growing up on a farm, I learned you got to watch your step, and it served me well for this job as well. My coverage responsibilities are primarily general and primary election, state government in general, which includes the staffing the legislative sessions. By my count, this year marks my 33rd session that I've covered, but the books are still closed on it. So there's still a second special session to come up here later this month.
Thank you, Rod. And Victoria Bassetti.
Hi, so I'm Victoria Bassetti. I'm a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice, which is a organization out of New York, NYU School of Law that focuses on democracy issues. And I specialize in voting rights issues. And then in addition, I specialize in legislative capacity and in the kind of separation of powers issues, how our legislatures interact with the executives, governors, and courts, and how the three branches together are key to the way our democracy functions.
Thank you. So we have, as you can see, we have a great panel today, especially interesting because they all have a very different set of expertise and set of backgrounds. So I'm excited to get into the discussion. I especially want to thank Victoria for joining us here on short notice. So I do have questions prepared, and the panelists have seen these questions in advance, but I'll also be asking follow-up questions depending on where the conversation goes. And once again, we encourage audience questions as well. Let me turn my first question to Charlie. In 2021, this past year, the legislature took some COVID-19 precautions, including holding some proceedings through video conferencing. Can you tell us more about what changes you made and how that came to fruition?
I think, Adam, the two biggest changes we made this year were all subcommittee meetings, which is every piece of legislation in the Senate gets assigned to a subcommittee. That doesn't mean they all get a subcommittee hearing, which is before a panel of 3 senators, but they all get assigned to a subcommittee. And if a bill is going to go through the process, the first thing it has to do is go through a subcommittee. And this is actually the only opportunity that lobbyists and the public get to come and actually speak directly on legislation. Okay, during the committee process and floor debate, the public and lobbyists can only listen. They can't actively speak like you can at a subcommittee. So this year, I think the biggest thing we did was subcommittees were done via Zoom so that we didn't have people, we needed social distance. So we didn't have a room full of people sitting there all closely near each other trying to talk. And it not only did it help as far as the COVID protocols, but I think it really enhanced transparency and the ability of the public for the first time to ever see that without having to drive to the Capitol in Des Moines to watch a subcommittee. And they can now do it via Zoom. So I think that was the first really big and important step. And then the other one was all of the various committees that legislation goes through that gets assigned by topic were all done in the legislative chamber, in the Senate chamber. And so the public were able to witness and see those proceedings online, and we actually kept archives of that. So I think those were the two really major things the Senate did this year in dealing with COVID, as well as enhancing transparency of the process.
Thank you. Rod, I think that was a pretty good overview of some of the changes, but from a journalist perspective, as somebody who's spent a lot of time in the building for 30 years now, how did the 2021 session compare to others you've covered?
I would say it was probably like no other. It was the first time I've had to cover the legislature without actually setting foot in the Capitol. While lawmakers were in regular session, given the COVID protocols and various health concerns, and with all the remote capability, it made it possible to cover it without physically being on site. But that also presented challenges to overcome. There were times when if you didn't have a good internet connection or there was a glitch that you couldn't tell if it was on your end or their end, you could see that a proceeding had started, but you couldn't hear or follow what was going on. So you kind of go into a little bit of panic mode. It was one of those you don't know what you've got till it's gone moments. And that it drove home, for me anyway, the fact that there's no substitute for being in the chamber in person to hear the debate firsthand and to be able to talk with someone face to face to get a better understanding of the process or what the legislation means or things of that nature. I did a rough count, and I think roughly 20% of the Senate are first-term members that I don't know because I wasn't at the Capitol and haven't met them, and that's never happened in the time that I've covered there. It's a strange thing not to be able to like have a kind of a personal relationship with someone that you're covering to get a better understanding both for them and for yourself. So this was different.
Victoria, I want to bring you in to offer some national context. When you look at state houses across the country, what were the trends of what they tended to do both in the 2020 sessions and the 2021 session?
So obviously with a really huge caveat that it's kind of difficult to say that to categorize what 50 different legislatures. So there was, pretty substantial variation within this. But in general, legislatures in many ways followed much the pattern as the rest of America and the way most businesses operate. Initially kind of stunned, not quite sure how to operate and move forward. And then hope that maybe this was only going to last about 6 weeks and everything would come back to normal afterwards. And then a kind of a slow and somewhat stuttering adaptation to the situation. So some states were extraordinarily well prepared with contingency plans in place. For example, Wisconsin had already had many years worth of contingency plans and technology and centers put in place to kind of help essentially put their entire legislative process online and remote. Other states just shut down, and in many cases, the shutdown exacerbated a growing tendency within some legislatures for an increasing concentration of power within the hands of either the speaker or the majority leader. And then slowly, as the pandemic evolved, they began kind of coming back into session, adopting new technology and new means. There were, as always, some incredibly funny moments as people tried to conduct hearings or pass legislation on Zoom. I think one of my personal favorites happened in a federal congressional hearing where a congressman was upside down for the entire hearing because he couldn't get his Zoom working properly. And now with us almost 2 years into this, as with Iowa, I think most people have adapted and created plans for how to create these sort of like hybrid legislative sessions.
Right on. My favorite was
I should actually point out that there have been some substantive, sort of like the way laws have been not enacted, but the types of laws that have been enacted that we'll get a chance to talk about a little bit later on, not just kind of process.
When you talk about Zoom mishaps, my favorite was it was a lawyer in court and he had a cat face and he insisted he wasn't a cat, but that's what a cat would say.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Excuse me. Let me turn back to Charlie. As you know, I imagine there was some criticism from the minority party this year that the legislature's COVID policies were too lax. Can you just tell us generally how policies like that are established at the State House, and also what's the role of the legislative leadership and what's the role of hired staff like yourself?
So the COVID protocols in Iowa this year were an agreement between the Senate Majority Leader, Jack Whitfer, and the Speaker of the House, Pat Grassley. Because we have some joint employees, and just as far as passing legislation, there's some joint rules. So obviously you have to have some cooperation between the chambers, how certain things are going to be done. But the protocols were also chamber specific a little bit. The Senate did some things that were different from the House and vice versa as far as the COVID protocols and dealing with this. My job was to help implement those things, the policies, to help oversee them, as well as make sure that the technology part got done. We needed to order the equipment. We needed to make sure that we had people that were up to speed on how to run a Zoom meeting and those kind of things. So, and we had to do all that in a little bit of a tight time frame as the pandemic, changed and went over the course of time, but between March of 2020, and then when the legislative session started this January of 2021. So a lot of things had to happen in a short amount of time, and trying to balance the interests that were involved, people's feelings on things, Iowa's constitution that requires certain things in the law. So it was really a very challenging balancing test of interest. And as Rod said in his introduction, I've never experienced a legislative process that was like this last year, a legislative session. It was extremely unique for a lot of reasons.
Charlie, I want to focus in on something you mentioned there, which is that, and I think a lot of people don't quite understand this, is that the House and Senate are separate entities with different leadership. They happen to be controlled by the same party, and they're in agreement about some things, but they can set their own rules. And so moving forward, when they're thinking about, what's going to be the role of remote access and video hearings moving forward, we could see different offerings by the House and the Senate. Is that right?
Adam, you're absolutely correct. The House and Senate are separate constitutional bodies. I mean, they do make up the General Assembly under Iowa's Constitution, but they are separate bodies, oversee their own proceedings, their own rules under the Constitution. And so you sometimes see some differences. This year you saw it in how the subcommittees were done. The Senate had subcommittees where people were able to interact via Zoom. The House had a little bit different. You could watch a subcommittee, but I think you could only interact if you were live. So you may see some other things like that are different. The House, and it was actually when I was chief clerk of the House, put the cameras in the chamber first back in, I think it was 2011 or 2012. We first did that in the House so people could see the debate going on the floor. The Senate the next year did it. So there's sometimes differences between the two bodies on how they deal with some of these types of issues. That's absolutely correct.
Thanks. Rod, let me come back to you. Something I think both you and Charlie have mentioned, but the subcommittees are really where the public input process happens in the Iowa legislature. That's the one chance where constituents can go sound off on the record. Being that those were held remotely, or people could chime in remotely, and that many people didn't show up to the State House at all. What do you think? How did the dynamic change by allowing the public into without being in Des Moines to participate?
Yeah, I would say it changed the dynamic significantly. Most of the committee rooms in the Capitol aren't, they're of good size, but they probably just hold somewhere between 50 and 100 people, sometimes less, sometimes a little more. But parking also is a premium, especially when it's a busy time. There's a lot of people there, so generally, subcommittees would attract lobbyists, paid lobbyists, or active advocates on issues, people of that nature. But the average Iowan usually wouldn't take time off from work to drive to the Capitol to try to make their positions known or opinions, and so this enabled. I remember I was talking with a broadcast reporter after one subcommittee meeting, and she was saying that she had testimony from a person from Lamar's and a person from Burlington. We're about as far flung across the state as you could get, and you wouldn't get that kind of input. And I kind of put out a little survey to lawmakers to ask them how they, what they took away from the change in the subcommittee. And it seemed like most of them consistently said that they felt that it engaged more people in the process that ordinarily wouldn't be engaged in the process. And so that was a real upside. Since I cover the Senate and another reporter covers the House, I kind of was living in a charmed life because the Senate to me had a much better setup. And when somebody would testify, it would put their name up, which is gold, to see how somebody's name is spelled. They don't know and whatever. And so, but on the House side, it was old. And luckily, there was only a few times I had to cover their proceedings, but it was much more challenging to hear, to tell who, like when somebody introduced themselves, to even catch what the name was. And so in the future, whatever improvements or changes they make, I hope they follow the Senate model. And that's a shout out to Charlie.
I've spent a lot more time covering local government and state government, but I noticed that at city council too, that for the first time, public speaking, they had to type their name into Zoom. And so we didn't have to ask them how to spell it. So that was like a huge bonus for journalists. So I want to speak for a couple of minutes about a paper that you wrote last year, Victoria, for the Brennan Center. This is really, when this was published, or when you were doing the work, we were really still at the height of the pandemic. We didn't really know how things were going to shake out. But you wrote that the way that they adjusted legislative processes during the pandemic was hurried and it doesn't promote robust deliberation. Can you go into a little bit more detail about that, of how do those shutdowns or suspensions affect the process?
Yeah, and just to kind of reiterate it, it's hard to remember now, but Zoom was sort of a new technology to most of us, in March of 2020. And the idea of being able to conduct a legislative hearing on Zoom had in most states simply never been contemplated before. And much less the idea or the prospect of being able to, have an actual vote, of the full institution of the Senate or the House, as the case might be, over Zoom. It was unexplored, as I said, with a few notable exceptions. And as a result, when most state legislatures went out of session in March of 2020, they didn't have the technical capacity. They hadn't rehearsed anything in terms of the way they might conduct it. It was a very stuttering effort. And as a result, many state legislatures just, as I said, it kind of accelerated a trend towards ceding power or decision making to like small committees or to the Senate Majority Leader or the Speaker of the House, as the case might be, and also to the governor. So by kind of essentially suspending operations, the governor with the executive power was oftentimes just left in charge. And every state is very different in terms of the level of kind of emergency powers that are granted to their governors. In some cases, the governor's ability to exercise emergency powers is very time limited, and the powers that a governor can exercise are also highly constrained. In other states, it's sweeping authority. For example, in New York, the governor has virtually unlimited across time emergency powers once an emergency is declared. And not only does the governor have kind of untime limited emergency power, but the governor can suspend laws under their emergency powers. And with the legislature sort of kind of withdrawing from the field the way they did in the spring of 2020. There's no way of quantifying this, but there was a, like in my estimation, it kind of created almost a pressure cooker where the legislatures weren't engaged, weren't kind of meeting regularly, weren't kind of doing what they normally do and kind of grappling with legislative issues. And when they finally got back into session, either in person or they kind of stood up Zoom sessions and stood up Zoom committee meetings, there was a kind of almost an explosion of anger about everything that was going on. And you saw that in the kind of late spring, early summer of 2020, when there were so many kind of protests and anger about the governor's power. And since then, we've kind of continued to see this renegotiation of kind of power dynamics between governors and legislative branches of the states. So for example, kind of I looked this up, I think in the since 2020, 46 states have passed legislation or other constitutional amendments that have recrafted the emergency powers of governors. That never would have happened but for what happened with COVID. And then also there's been, I think, a silver lining, as you guys, as Charlie and Rod have indicated, as the legislatures have kind of adapted to Zoom legislating. It has kind of ushered in a new era of transparency and participation as well. So it's been I think, people will look back on these 2 years as kind of seminal years in reworking the way we legislate and also the power dynamics between the executive branch and state legislatures. It's unleashed a kind of both a creativity and a tension that hadn't been present beforehand.
And maybe it's hard to characterize, but is the trend for legislatures to take back more power from their executives or to instate powers?
The trend has been to take back more power. And in some cases that hasn't been the prettiest of engagements. It's been very rocky between some governors and their legislatures. Obviously, partisan divides have been have exacerbated and made it harder in certain states. But even in states that are kind of so-called trifecta states, there's which is to say that the same party controls the state legislature, the executive branch, and the court system. That even in trifecta states, there's been a lot of kind of tension and conflict between the executive branch and the courts and the legislatures as they kind of try to sort out the issues that have arisen because of the new dynamic.
Thank you.
And just to put a finer point on it, or to tell a few more stories, like in Michigan, it's been highly contested, to the point of, kind of almost outright violence. That's not a trifecta state, it's divided government. In New York, which is a trifecta state, there's been the legislature has also had a kind of an intense level of conflict with the governor over emergency powers.
Right. We've been talking about the last couple of years of COVID. I want to take a little bit longer view of modernizing government, just to kind of put this discussion in context. But Charlie, you alluded to this at the beginning, but you've been in government a long time. You and I first interacted when you were working with the ethics board. What are the biggest technology changes you've seen over your career where now, we can download bills and things online rather than print?
Adam, you look too young to remember my time at the Ethics and Campaign Disclosure Board, but I do remember. I've been very, very fortunate in my time in government to have been at the Ethics and Campaign Disclosure Board at a time we were able to implement an electronic filing system for candidates, PACs, lobbyists, and others to be able to disclose their mandatory disclosures online, and then to create a searchable database of that kind of information. I mean, we went from people having to go to Des Moines to see a report or to have it mailed to them, to then we were scanning thousands of pages of papers, to then being able to do it all online was really amazing. I mean, that was, to me, looking back on it, one of my proudest moments in government, that we were able to get an electronic filing system in place, and then to have the legislature actually mandate that so many reports have to be filed electronically, starting with campaign reports, and then it went to lobbying and some other ethics reports that are filed by governmental officials. I think that'll be something that I'm proud of for the rest of my career. And then, of course, when I was chief
Charlie,
clerk,
can I bust in? When
yeah.
did you
Yeah,
do
please.
that? When did you do that? How long
That
ago?
that was between 2001 and when I left in 2010.
Because the
we were-
U.S. Senate still doesn't do electronic filing of its campaign reports.
That's amazing to me
Yeah.
that we still see governments that don't.
Yeah.
But I do remember a time during that decade where there were legislators that were saying, we will never have mandatory electronic filing in the state. And then, of course, the law passed and we're there. And now I think most people, if you said you have to file something by paper, they'd look at you like you were crazy. I mean, society's really changed. The other big thing then was when I was, as I've referenced before, chief clerk of the House, being able to put the cameras in the chamber so that Iowans could see actual legislative debate and have those archived, was the second thing that I'm really proud of. And then even this last session, and although we had to do it under a horrible situation that's negatively impacted, so many people, the fact that we were able to do some technology changes that I think will probably stay in place and really enhance the transparency of the governmental process. Those are the three things, Adam, I think I'm going to be the proudest of when I'm finally done in state government.
Yeah, it's really hard to understate the effect that has on, certainly the journalistic process, where, the fact that we can, access thousands and thousands of candidate PDFs and things like that empowers, citizen journalists, just concerned citizens who want to look into that thing. Rod, like I said before, you've been at it a long time. What are the biggest tech changes you've noticed?
I would say the placing of cameras in the chambers, going paperless, and the setting up of a legislative website, I think were significant in the technology area. Back in the old days of when it wasn't paperless, there would be, during the shutdowns, it gets a little crazy anyway, but there would be negotiations that would go on, and they would reach an agreement, and then they would have to draft it, and then they would have to print it, and then they would have to have the pages physically distributed to each lawmaker at their desks, and that became so time intensive, and especially if something was presented and it wasn't quite right, and it had to go back and get redrafted and then reprinted. I mean, it was sometimes the shutdowns were weekend shutdowns where you would get there Friday morning and you would leave Sunday. In fact, the worst case scenario was I went one Friday and went literally from the fall of the gavel in the Senate to Governor Branstad's 9 a.m. Monday press conference. And so I welcome the paper revolution. The website provides a lot of information. It's kind of hard to navigate. There's probably ways they could make it more user-friendly, but it's a wealth of information that before you would have to go try to track down yourself physically. And so those, I think, were the biggest changes.
Right.
For the better.
Yeah, government websites are not known for being, super user-friendly. And sometimes the problem is that there's too much information out there, but it's better than less information. But the reason I think this historical look is interesting is because at all these points that governments made changes like this, there was resistance to it, or there was people that thought that it wouldn't be useful. And so now governments are having these conversations of, which part of our, stay-at-home pandemic response are we going to keep in place moving forward? And I think that you will look back at this point in 10 or 15 years, and we'll think it's nuts that city council meetings weren't streaming online and things like that. So I think that's some helpful context. Victoria, I want to bring in some federal context. Congress is, the whole federal government is, notoriously averse to changing its processes. They did change a few things during the pandemic, which you have mixed feelings about. Can you explain?
Well, so, one of the key issues that was whether or not, so first of all, there was a general consensus, although untested, whether or not in-person voting was required in the House of Representatives and the Senate. In other words, whether or not, you could, kind of vote by Zoom. The conclusion was that you could only vote in person. Untested, no one ever thought to kind of fight it out in the courts, probably with good reason. And when they decided that, there was a kind of a move towards allowing proxy, or a push to allow proxy voting. Which is to say, you're not physically present, you hand essentially your proxy over to another member who votes for you. And that's a practice that occurs in many state legislatures as well. You're allowed to vote by proxy in committees, or in some state legislatures, even under limited circumstances on final passage on the kind of the committee of the whole in the legislature. And the real question is kind of twofold. The first is, when you kind of encourage or allow a lot of proxy voting, you once again concentrate power in the hands of a few select members who hold those proxies and, have the ability to kind of wield them the way they want. But the second more interesting issue that arises when you kind of discuss proxy voting is how important it is to be a present legislator. And this is one of the things that we've been talking about in this conversation, which is about how central it is to the process of legislating that you're there in person, that you've got those little side conversations going on, that you've got the kind of deals being cut on the floor, that there's the kind of looking each other in the eye. And when you've got like kind of loose rules for proxy voting, you intentionally or unintentionally encourage absentee legislating. Or and so kind of in general, that sort of should probably be discouraged, that proxy voting.
So an all Zoom legislature would be bad in your view, because they're not together, deliberating.
That's different, obviously, than proxy, because you can require that someone actually be in their Zoom box when they cast their votes,
Right.
rather than just kind of handing a piece of paper over to another person. But I mean, that's one of the things I think both Rod and Charlie have been talking about is like we're kind of renegotiating, legislatures are all renegotiating this concept of having to all physically be present in the same room with one another in order to get business done. And I think kind of settled expectations are really changing. I think people used to think, oh my God, we really all have to be in the same room in order to get anything done. And people are kind of discovering a new way of working, a kind of a hybrid way that allows Zoom, but also still kind of gives, credit and values the all together, kind of everyone being together in one room sort of process of legislating. It's a hybrid now. When I wrote the paper last year, I couldn't imagine legislating without all being in person. Now I've had 18 months of getting lots of stuff done in Zoom boxes. So
Right.
it's different. Yeah.
Charlie, just like the federal government, state legislatures, I think, are known for being a little bit slow to change. Some of that is maybe cultural, just they're prone to tradition, and some of it is really logistical and technological. How do those issues shake out?
Well, Adam, I think you're right. I think it's a mix of logistical. I think you need to make sure that your your state constitution permits some of these things. The last thing you want to do is pass legislation, have it struck down in court because you had some sort of voting that was not permitted under the Constitution. I know some states flat out say you have to be in person. I don't think Iowa's is there, but there's some things that we looked at that I think would have to be sorted out before you even started to think about not having floor debate, for example, in the actual building. But I think starting in Iowa with the subcommittee made a lot of sense doing it that way. I also think that there needs to be some perfection of Zoom and other technology. I mean, making sure that people can get on and watch a subcommittee and interact, I think was important. Yet we had an unfortunate incident where someone showed some graphic pornography during a subcommittee on an education bill, which meant you had people that were, you had minors that were on watching it. We had pages that were minors that were actually monitoring the subcommittee. So those kind of things present some challenges that I think we need to get cleaned up. Rod pointed out there were some other technology things that made some things challenging. So I think all of it is kind of combined together in legal, technology, and everything to just see what the future is going to bring as we look to improve and consider what we need to do going forward.
Probably for next session, and I understand you still have a special session stint, but for 2022, do you expect remote subcommittees, those things to persist?
Leadership's having those kind of conversations and looking at it. I hate to speculate, but my guess is that the subcommittee process will still have some sort of Zoom component that would allow the public to interact. There might also be the ability to people to go back to being at the subcommittee in person, but I think it would be very challenging and not make a lot of sense to necessarily take the Zoom component away. I think that was great technology. We have the equipment already purchased. There's no sense putting that stuff, up in the attic of the Capitol. We might as well utilize it. And we kind of had proof of concept a little bit that works at the subcommittee level. So I think that will probably stay in place. And, again, I hate to speculate, but my guess is that you will still see Senate committees being some sort of live stream of that and archive, so people will be able to see the subcommittee process either live or at least go back and see it archived. And of course, we'll keep the cameras for floor debate.
Right. That's all good to hear. We have about 10 minutes left. I've got a couple more questions, and I want to leave time for each of our panelists to give some closing thoughts. But if there are any audience questions, here's your last call to put those in. Ryan, I want to turn a question to you. The Iowa Capitol Press Association was formed last year to be a voice for journalists covering the legislature. What topics is the legislature looking at, and especially as that pertains to the way COVID has changed reporting in the State House?
I think the association, and this sort of goes off topic, but they're advocating for all of state government, but especially the governor's office to be more transparent and compliant with open records requests. We've seen a situation where information has been slow walked or not been forthcoming at all. And also dating back to Governor Ray, he established a tradition where, in fact, he would do it daily, which was probably too much. But he established that every week, on Monday morning, there would be a press conference. And on Friday, they would put out a public schedule that would show all the upcoming places where the governor would be. For whatever reason, both of those traditions have been trashed. There is no public schedule that comes out. A lot of times you'll get notice. One time, Betty DeVos was going to be in Pella with the governor, and I got the notice 1 hour. I mean, it's a 40-minute drive to Pella, so granted I could have made it, but I didn't. The other thing that we just had an association meeting tonight, the topic that was front and center was with COVID, the press was moved out of the chamber, and there was an area in the balcony set aside for people to cover, but it doesn't meet the standards of what especially broadcasters need. It was difficult to hear. When you're quoting somebody, you want to be able to quote them correctly, and they want to be quoted correctly. So it's it behooves everybody for things to kind of be at their optimum. I think somebody did a search and was citing a journal from 1900 where they were listing the seat assignments in the press row. So it's a feeling there's a move afoot to move the press off the floor permanently. And that's of major concern. So those are kind of the things that are front and center for the association.
Thanks. I got one more question for Victoria before I open it up for a couple closing thoughts. And this is kind of more of a forward-looking question, but pandemics, of course, are just one type of emergency. What should state governments be doing to strengthen their emergency operation plans right now?
Yeah, so I think, we have to imagine the unimaginable. We have to anticipate things that we never really kind of anticipated before. Obviously, there's the pandemic. Natural disasters are kind of an increasing concern. Power outages, ransomware attacks, hacks. There's just an extraordinary number of threats that legislatures or pretty much anyone is facing at this stage of the game for continuity of operations. So I think that every legislature really kind of needs to have a table kind of ready and thinking through all of these and kind of kicking the tires for whether or not they're ready when it happens. Just a story from personal experience. I was working on Capitol Hill in 2001 when 9/11 happened. But people kind of forget not too long after 9/11, there was a major anthrax attack. And all of a sudden, with virtually no warning, all of the Senate buildings were evacuated. I was kicked out. I left work one day, and the next day I came back and I had crime scene tape around it, and with no warning, and nothing. No files I could get out of my office. Nothing. Ended up having to work. We were drafting the USA Patriot Act that week. I ended up having to park myself on a park bench with a cell phone and one physical copy of the US Criminal Code. And that's how we helped negotiate a major rewrite of the United States terrorism laws. We weren't prepared for it. And I think that we should acknowledge that whatever happens, we think we're prepared, but we're not. And so I think every state legislature needs to game it out and think about how they're going to react to everything, because we live in an era of kind of increasingly volatile, strange events. So it can't hurt to be prepared.
Thank you. We have a couple minutes left. I want to make sure you each have a chance. If you have anything you didn't get to mention, or if there's ways that folks can connect with you that you want to plug, I'll give you each a few seconds here. Victoria.
You can follow me on Twitter at @vbass. That's where I put most of my stuff up. Although I'm not the best Twitterer, but that's where you can follow me to find out papers that I'm writing. I'm working on a few kind of papers right now. So if people are interested, they can do that.
And I can say Victoria follows back. I followed her yesterday, and she followed me right back. So, Rod, any closing thoughts?
No, I don't believe so. I I mean, under the heading of modernizing the legislature and the climate we're in, where the focus is on government mandating and taking away people's individual freedom, I will note that it's been the long-standing mandate in the Iowa Senate that men have to wear a jacket and a tie. And so that's an interesting juxtaposition there.
I appreciate the point. And Charlie, any final thoughts?
Adam, thanks for doing this. And going back to Victoria's point, I have spent in the last year more time on the concept of continuity of operations than I ever had in all my years of government combined. And it's something that's so important to do. And technology is obviously going to be a part of that. But I also think it's important that we don't lose the fact that with part of this is continuity of operations, but we also do have the opportunity to embrace enhanced transparency for the public, which I think is also very valuable.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I really appreciate the panelists. This has been a great discussion. I appreciate you staying after work hours here. I also want to give a shout out to Amy, who's been our behind the scenes help today. And thank you to our audience members for hanging out with us this afternoon. This is the end of your virtual schedule for the day, but we'll be back in action at 8:30 tomorrow, I believe, for another keynote. So stay tuned to Iowa Ideas in your Whova app for the agenda. Once again, thank you to everyone, and that's a wrap.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Thanks, Adam.